Good evening. Welcome to Saturday Night Scares. Scary stories for adults and brave teens. I'm Kelly, librarian at the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County, and tonight our selection is the short story The Enchanted Doll from the book Ghosts of Key West by David L. Sloan. This collection of short stories comes from my very favorite place, Key West, Florida. It's about the people that come to visit and can never leave. A true story, depending on how much you care to believe. This is The Enchanted Doll. Anne Otto sat on the bench in front of her baby grand piano. From her posture alone, it was easy to tell that she was a proud woman, and the ease with which her fingers glided across the keys was a sure sign of a classically trained pianist. If it were not for her occasional breaks when she strove to make her timing exact, anyone passing by would be convinced that the beautiful music inside the most unique house on Eaton Street was coming from a recording. Anne was always happiest at her piano. She had plans to tour the world as a concert pianist, but all of that had changed after she met Gene. How romantic it was. He was an artist, she a musician, two Americans whose paths and whose hearts crossed in Paris. It was probably that first portrait he painted of me, she thought to herself as her fingers continued to make music. What a charming young man he was back then. "We have to be at the gallery in half an hour." Anne snapped back to reality as Gene's voice boomed from upstairs. It was to be a big show for Gene, but then again, every show was a big one to him. Anne was tired of all the fake smiles and empty compliments. She wanted to stay home and play her piano. Gene would have none of it. Gene Otto was a unique character. He was born into a family of doctors, but rejected medicine to pursue his love of art. His talent was second to none in Key West. And though he loved Anne even more than the paintings he so treasured, tonight's show was important to him, and she should be more understanding. Did she not realize that he did all of this for her? "You go without me," Anne said coldly, standing her ground. They had been through this before, and she had always given in. This time will be different, she told herself. Gene was not pleased with her unwillingness to go, and an argument ensued. As words were exchanged, Anne rose from the piano and stormed through the kitchen to the back gardens. Gene followed, but as she began to raise her voice, he backed down immediately. "Not outside. Do you want the neighbors to hear?" The argument was over. Anne went to her bedroom, Gene to his, and they prepared to go to the gallery. It seemed pointless to argue with Gene. Blame was something he did not accept very well, especially when it came to his treatment of Anne. She knew he was an artist with an eccentric side to him. However, when it came to blaming things on Robert, she knew that something strange was happening. What could she do? Robert was a doll. He was given as a gift to Gene Otto back in 1904 when Gene was only 4 years old. Some people say it was a gift from his grandfather, but most agree that it came from a girl of Bahamian descent who was an acquaintance of the Otto family. Gene and Robert had a strange relationship from the start. Gene's first gesture of friendship for the doll was to give him his name. It was at this point in his life that Robert Eugene Otto started going by Gene. Robert seemed only too fitting for the doll as it was crafted in young Gene's image. Constructed of cloth and stuffed with straw, Robert stood 3 feet tall, had dull black buttons for eyes, and a face with monkey-like features. Over the years, the doll took on the likeness of a burn victim. Boy and doll spent all their time together, and as in adulthood, whenever Gene was blamed for doing something wrong, he refused to accept responsibility. "I didn't do it, Robert did it." A pattern was developing that would haunt people for years to come. Anne first discovered Robert when she and Gene returned from Paris. As a wedding gift, they were to move into the house where Gene had grown up, and though Anne was a bit leery at first, all apprehensions disappeared when they pulled up in front of her new home. It was in the heart of Old Town Key West, just blocks away from everything. As Anne admired the Victorian architecture, complete with a royal turret rising majestically above the second floor, Gene explained that shipbuilders were responsible for the construction of their home, which had been built around 1890. Anne felt like a princess in a fairy tale as she passed through the wrought iron gate with sculpted concrete pedestals and up the stairs towards the etched glass design of the entryway. The inside of the house was equally impressive. Polished hardwood floors, 12-foot ceilings, textured wallpaper. Everything was perfect. This would be an ideal home. Shortly after moving in, Gene began spending a lot of time in the attic. When asked what he was doing, Gene explained that he was building a room for Robert. Who's Robert? Anne asked, unaware that they were expecting house guests. When Jean introduced her to the doll, it was all she could do to keep from laughing. Was he really building this room for a doll? Jean didn't think it was funny. Construction in the attic was completed, and Robert was the proud occupant of an 8 by 12 room, complete with slanted ceilings, making it difficult for an adult to stand up. Though the attic itself was much larger, Jean thought this size would be best for Robert. And to ensure his comfort, Jean furnished the room with scale-sized furniture and provided Robert with a wardrobe of clothing much like the garments he had worn as a child. Anne learned to tolerate this, but Robert was not confined to his room alone. You boys run along, Anne scolded from her front porch at the small group of school kids looking mischievously at the top of her house. They did not seem to need much encouragement as they turned the corner and ran. It moved, it moved, she heard one of the kids saying. Curious as to what mischief they were causing, Anne stepped into the street and looked back at her house. That doll. Jean had Robert perched in the window of the turret room looking out towards the street. Playing dolls with the school kids, are you? Anne joked to Jean, calling from his bedroom window. The only time she went to the turret room was to pose for the portraits that Jean painted of her. Not only was the light in the turret ideal for painting, but it gave a grand view of Eaton Street. Anne was always excited to have company, and she would sometimes watch for their arrival from the turret. As Anne climbed the stairs to see how his work was coming, Jean assured her that he was not playing with dolls. The kids say they saw him moving, she teased. Maybe he did, Jean replied. Maybe he did. A strange feeling came across the room, and the doll seemed to glare at her. We've got to get rid of that thing, she thought. July 25th, 1974 was a sad day on the island. Anne Otto lost her husband, and Key West lost a great artist. Jean had grown ill in his final years, and it had taken its toll on Anne. Rumors around town said that Jean had become physically abusive to her in the months before his death, some saying he went so far as to lock her in a small closet. But those who knew the Ottos dismissed this as pure rubbish. Some stories claimed that when Jean was confronted with the abuse, he blamed the doll. Shortly after Jean's death, Anne left Key West and headed for Boston to be with her family. Not wanting anything to do with the doll she had grown to hate, she left Robert behind in the attic room where he was encountered by many over the next few years. It is believed that a clause was included in the house's lease agreement specifying that Robert must remain the sole occupant of the attic room. This was the case until Anne's death in 1976. Yet strange stories continued circulating as soon as she left the house. I was doing some work in the larger part of the attic of the house, a local plumber explained. The people there wanted to make it an additional room, so I was running the lines for a new toilet. The doll looked pretty creepy, sitting there on the little chair holding its stuffed animal, but I had work to do, so I didn't think much about it at first. As my work continued, I had to make a few trips downstairs to get some parts from the van. Each time I returned, I could swear the doll had moved a little bit. Like I said, I had work to do, so I ignored it as much as I could. But when I'd finished the job and started descending the stairs, I heard a little kid giggling behind me. When I turned around, the doll was on the opposite side of the room. The first thing I did was look to see where the kid was, but no one was there. I wasn't really frightened, but it was so weird that I just continued downstairs and left. Some of my tools are probably still up there. Two men who rented the house in the mid-1970s shared similar reports. There was constant noise and such coming from the room. Sometimes it was like little kids laughing, and other times like someone was rummaging around. When it first started happening, we would go upstairs to check it out, but always found nothing. It was only after a half dozen times that we realized the doll had moved. At first, we blamed each other and laughed it off as a practical joke. Sometimes the doll's head would be looking in a different direction. Other times its arms were propped up around the chair, and once its legs were even crossed. It started happening with greater frequency, and we realized that this was no joke. So we packed the doll away in a seed chest and never had any more problems with him. A few months later, the owner of the house died, and the building was sold and converted into a bed and breakfast. The Artist House was a fitting name for Key West's newest guest house. A tribute to Gene Otto and all of Key West's artists, the building captured the feeling of the island like no other, with its unique turrets and freshly painted purple shutters. Over the years, the house changed hands a few times, and Robert eventually found himself a new home. Von Pfister Street was a nice place for Robert, but he missed the house he had grown up in. Sitting on the front porch all day, watching the traffic go by helped to pass the time, and he certainly enjoyed resting up against the tree each Christmas. But he was old and fragile, so his owners took him to the East Martello Museum where he could be properly cared for. Upon arrival, Robert was taken to a back room where he was eventually locked up and left covered with a bedsheet. "Robert, you have a visitor," the young lady soothed as she carried the doll from his closet to a large oak table. "This man wants to take some photographs." She continued to pamper the doll, straightening the collar of his sailor suit, adjusting his sailor's cap, and pointing his pixie-toed feet in the proper direction. Time had taken its toll on the doll, deteriorating the fabric on his face and exposing his straw and metal frame. The white of his costume was yellowed. Somewhere along the way, he had even lost an ear, but that did not stop Eileen from speaking to him. "Do you always talk to the doll like that?" David asked. "Just to play it safe," she responded. With that, Eileen left, and David began snapping photos. A strange air filled the room. David was surrounded by a circle of dry heat and was overcome with the feeling of being watched. He turned around to see if Eileen was still in the room, but she was gone. Half a roll of film was shot from every angle possible, and then David moved in for some close-ups. The first 2 shots went fine, but Robert's hat was blocking his eyes. As David reached for the cap to remove it, Robert glared at him as if warning him to stop. The doll's blank eyes took on a life of their own, and Robert actually looked as though he were about to move. "I've been reading too many stories," the photographer convinced himself. He studied the shot for a close-up of the eyes and clicked the shutter. Nothing happened. He tried again and then checked the camera in an attempt to detect the problem. Everything appeared to be in order, so a third attempt was made. Nothing again. Deciding to call it a day, David placed his camera on the table. 3 quick flashes went off, and Robert looked as though he was laughing. David looked again at the doll, black eyes, and the energy seemed to fade away from the doll. Definitely time to call it a day, David thought. As word about the haunted doll continued to spread around town, more and more people came to visit Robert. Eventually, the museum decided it would be easiest to put him in a display case, and he now sits locked behind glass with some other dark reminders of Key West's past. Reports of movement behind the glass, as well as unexplainable camera malfunctions, continue to this day. Jack Wharton tells his story. "My friend and I heard about the doll, and I was fascinated. I've had personal experiences with ghosts in the past, so I was anxious to go to the museum, but Frank was a complete skeptic. For the entire ride over, he kept repeating how silly this was. When the trolley stopped in front of the museum, we headed in and went straight to see Robert. I wanted to take some photos, and Frank wanted to joke around. 'Hey, big ears, that your girlfriend in the case next to you?' Frank taunted, referring to another stuffed doll nearby. I told him to stop messing around, but his taunting continued. I tried to snap a photo of Robert, but my camera didn't work. Though I had just replaced the battery before coming to Key West, the red light indicated it was dead. Frank had a few pictures left on his roll, so he volunteered to take some shots for me. As the flash went off, a strange sound came from Frank's camera. The film had jammed, and his entire roll of Key West photos was destroyed in the process of unjamming it. No sooner had this happened than my camera started working again. Frank blamed it all on dumb luck, but I think it was Robert. Though Robert no longer lives in the artist house, the place is still bustling with activity. Strange things happen both inside and outside the house, but all the activity is not to be attributed to Robert. He is joined by other spirits in the house. Guests have reported doors opening and closing on their own, lights turn on or off for no apparent reason, sometimes illuminating despite the fact that they are unplugged. The dramatic temperature changes have been reported throughout the artist's house. In some of the more exciting encounters, visitors see the image of a woman in a wedding dress on the staircase, or awake to an apparition hovering over their bed in the middle of the night. Some have even reported conversations with the ghost of a lady who, though happy with the way her house has been taken care of, would like to see a particular set of drapes changed. More than a few people have had shivers travel up their spine as they observe the house from outside, and a shade mysteriously lifts to reveal the ghostly image of a woman. Though some believe Robert's spirit has returned to, or possibly never left, the artist house, they all seem to agree that his energies are confined to the attic room. It is said that when Anne Otto died, her spirit returned to protect the house and all guests from any harm. It is her ghost that watches from the window of the turret to see who is arriving, just as she did in her mortal life. Many theories exist as to why Robert behaves the way he does. Some call it voodoo, others attribute it to an ancient curse, and some believe Jean's ghost has returned to the doll he so loved. Robert is not the first case of an inanimate object taking on a personality, and he is probably not the last. Though we may never know all the answers surrounding these bizarre circumstances, Robert will always serve as a reminder. Beware of the objects you possess, or one day they may end up possessing you. If you are ever fortunate enough to visit Key West, there are so many fun, unique, and exciting things to do there. But I strongly recommend these two things. First, take a ghost tour. A guide will entertain and frighten you with stories just like the Enchanted Doll as you visit some of the spookiest, most haunted spots on the island. And second, visit Robert, if you're not too chicken. Yes, the Enchanted Doll himself is on display there on the island at the Fort East Martello Museum. He sits on his little chair, wearing his sailor suit with his own doll, a stuffed toy lion, sitting on his lap behind glass, just to be safe. But don't forget, if you want to take his picture, you must ask his permission first. If you're too scared to confront him face to face, just Google Robert the Doll, and you can see why this creepy doll gives everyone the shivers. Okay, that's all the time we have for tonight. We hope that you have enjoyed Saturday Night Scares. We will be back next week at 8:30 p.m. for another horror story. Join us again, if you dare.